Hello. Welcome to the latest episode of Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club. Today we're going to be talking about 1989's Drachenfels by Kim Newman, writing under the pen name Jack Yeovil. This was the first full Warhammer fiction novel released by GW Books. My friend Stu and I are going to delve into our thoughts, feelings, and theories all about this awesome book. But before we get into it, I'm just going to provide you with a little overview of the story. The book starts with the end of a great adventure. Oswald von Königswald, a young crown prince, and his ragtag party of heroes assembled over an arduous journey, a bounty hunter, his tutor and guardian, a squire, a soldier, a vampire, a dancing assassin, two dwarf warriors, and a wizard. These heroes are in search of the Great Enchanter, an evil, chaotic, necromantic, monstrous vampire, the legendary Drachenfels. On the path to Castle Drachenfels, most members of this party are cut down, many before we even meet them, and through the traps and encounters of a role-playing-esque dungeon, we find only Menesh the dwarf, Genevieve the vampire, and Oswald the prince still standing for the final encounter with Drachenfels. Menesh and Genevieve are knocked unconscious, but Oswald overcomes the monster and a legend is written. 25 years later, we meet Detlef Serk, a prodigiously talented, though perhaps pompous and self-aggrandizing, youngish playwright, director, and actor. At present, he's in prison for an enormous amount of debt, the result of a catastrophic theatrical failure. But lucky for him, to celebrate the anniversary of Drachenfel's defeat, Serk is freed from prison by the now older, wiser, and somehow even more handsome Crown Prince Oswald. The main thrust of the story is Serk's composition of this celebratory play, reassembling the surviving adventurers from Oswald's original party, and staging a performance for the Emperor in the ruins of Castle Drachenfels itself. There are omens, ghostly monks in the windows, phantom carriages in the caravan, but yet the play still progresses, and one by one, the adventurers of 25 years hence are killed as part of some chaotic ritual to resurrect Drachenfels. During the first performance of the play Drachenfels, the real Drachenfels himself re-emerges, and the real Oswald is revealed as well. The Crown Prince, now the Elector Count, has been in league with Drachenfels since his comically pathetic attempt to kill the vampire 2 decades earlier. Genevieve and Detlef face down Drachenfels, and through some literal deus ex machina, they defeat him. Meanwhile, Oswald attempts to assassinate the Emperor Karl Franz, and is then similarly defeated by Detlef, who, fortunately, had studied the same fencing forms from Oswald's former tutor. And then, all is well. We are treated to a denouement telling us the outcomes for pretty much every single character who was named in the book. So, Stu, before we start discussing the ins and outs, the multiple levels of the drama that is Drachenfels, how did you find it? Did you enjoy it?
Yes, lots. A lot more than I thought I would. And not because I thought it was going to be bad. I just thought it might be of its time a little bit. But there was some really, and it is in a sense, but there's some really, really fun parts in there. Bits that I found a surprise. And I don't always get surprised by books. I quite often see kind of things. I'm an annoying person that watches a film with my wife and will say, yeah, he did it or she did it or this is going to happen. And there were little twists and things. And the things I didn't expect. So from the start of the book, that's almost like a prologue, but I didn't realize it was a prologue to start with. I think it just starts as chapter 1, doesn't it? And I think it does, but it's that initial sort of start to the book, and then it completely changes the scene. And you think, oh, where's all those characters gone? And I love it. That point made me smile. I thought, oh, this is good. That was an interesting way of doing this. This book interests me now.
Yeah.
Whereas the beginning of the book, where it's very much that kind of the heroes reaching the end of their quest, they're all dying, nearly all of them dying, and it's like the end of the story. And I thought, okay, so the rest of the story is just going to tell us how they got there, and then at the end they might tell us what really happened. That was my kind of in-head guess of what it was going to be. And then it cuts to Detlef Serk in a sort of almost Victorian style Dickens-esque debtor's prison. And I was like, whoa, where's this gone? Act 1, what's this? And it took me a few moments to realize, okay, this is how the story's going to go. And I thought, this is good. Really, really surprised me.
Yeah, it's a big left turn out of the prologue and what you see there. Because I mean, I also absolutely loved it. I think it's a fantastic book. I know what you mean about there's certain elements that are of its time, but I think it's aged really, really well. The drama is great, the comedy is great, the horror is great, and then
Yes.
plot wise, it's just really well put together, I think. And yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That prologue, that intro, which is it is a classic story of, well, it's basically an advanced hero quest or a Warhammer quest adventure,
very
right?
fantasy, isn't it? Very
Yeah.
off the shelf fantasy. Written well. It's not badly written. Almost, I felt a bit like it was a start of a movie. Kind of the movies start with the action prologues rather than the building up to it. The ones that start with a major event.
Yeah, big action scene to
big start. It felt like that. I think my initial notes for it, I scribbled down movie-esque start. This is really, really good. And it was violent fight scene to start the book, right in the grips of the fight scene. And then it kind of got more bloody.
It was brutal, that the opening and the deaths of many of those heroes. But one of the things that I do think, because I agree, it was really cinematic. But I also think that he does. So Kim Newman writing as Jack Yeovil, who is a film critic as well as an author, spent a lot of time immersed in cinema and sort of brings a lot of that to it. But I think what he does that's incredibly effective is that you're actually getting real sort of character moments and little beats and explorations of who these heroes are, even as they're being offed and destroyed and exploding across the room. You're also finding out a little bit about them. You get a little bit of background. They're not quite like one-dimensional. There's a little bit of extra dimensions to each of them just before they are snuffed out.
So welcome to this character. They've done this, and by the way, I'm just going to kill them off, and in a really nasty way. But it's entertaining. They're entertaining deaths, aren't they? Deaths that make you think, oof. And at the demographic at the time, I can imagine a lot of young boys think this is brilliant. And so there's a lot of dark humor to those things you may have seen in 80s kind of horror films. But there was stuff that was a bit more dark as well. I mean, when they enter the chamber at the end, and he opens the portal or the window to the other realm, and that's almost, I don't know, it made me think of, and it wouldn't have been out at the time, but almost the demon realms in Constantine, or and then some of the monsters and things is almost Hellraiser-esque, isn't it? It's that real kind of grossed out but weird gross horror, not just kind of slasher. It's kind of that kind of real cringy, change through skin kind of weird stuff that you see in Warhammer through your realm of chaos and things like that. But it was just pretty dark and depressing. And who am I looking at through this window? Oh, the tortured soul of my father. This is dark stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, and the traps as well were quite effective, quite good D&D traps. I mean, there was the one that has caused Rudy Wegner to just collapse, crumpled into contorted. And he definitely seems like, right, that's the end of that character. And then there's the gargoyles that come out of the ceiling, which I love that scene. I'm a big fan of gargoyles, so getting to see some of them in the Warhammer world doing some cool stuff was great. But there's it's the party arriving at the climax. They face down Drachenfels in all of his fearful, magnificent glory. And we don't even get to see it because it fades to black, essentially, right? And we don't see the heroic moment of Oswald taking him out, but then we move beyond it, and we know it has happened, right? We're told, okay, Constant Drachenfels was defeated. Now let's move on to, as you say, this very different story. 25 years later, Detlef Sierck, a playwright who is now has run up an enormous debt because of a hugely ambitious but failed performance didn't even get to the performance of this other play, and we're just joining him in a prison.
And it's kind of, I suppose there's something, but I forgot this. I keep forgetting this because it's almost something you don't need, but there's a bit more background before that, isn't there? We've skipped a bit because in that second, before we get to Act 1, there's a chapter around Genevieve's background, isn't there? And I feel like we maybe skipped ahead.
We see Genevieve's
It's
background. We get some of
some
her.
of that to before we at the end of the kind of the main fight scene. We get a little bit
Sure.
of that. We get her background before we go to Detlef, don't we? Unless I'm misremembering the order.
I think we get. So
Um,
I think we get hints. I mean, I can't remember the specifics now that you mention it. Whether or not we see some of that once we know she's in the
if you look
convent
at
and
my
she's sort of
notes.
retired from heroic
Yeah,
life and
I
public
think it's
life.
chapter 2-ish, isn't it? I think that's before
Right.
we get there. I think there's a bit of background about Drachenfels' history and how he killed her father.
Sure.
Talks about when she was bitten herself, and there's all that. There's a little bit about Paravon and Bretonia when she was growing up. So there's definitely a bit of background scene setting for her, and
Mm.
then we leave that, I think. So they kind of we
Well,
set her
whichever
scene
order
up
that
as well.
is, we do jump into. So we get Detlef, and we get at
Yes,
some
but then
point
after that, he's definitely
yeah, we get Detlef
um,
Sec, and it's quite humorous as well. I think there's as much as it paints a picture of a very bleak circumstance that he's found himself in. You also
mhm,
really, or at least I found that I really enjoyed spending time with him because he is quite
yes,
witty and dry, and he's sort of taking all of this terrible fate in quite good humor, but his good humor sort of manifests as taking the mickey of it out of it and sort of being
yes.
very sarcastic about everything.
I think it's almost hopelessness, isn't it? But
Yeah,
he's. I can't remember. I should remember it because it's repeated 100 times in one paragraph. But the amount of money that he
sure.
owes, and it's that's
119,255
it.
gold pieces. Now I've got that written down, so I didn't remember it off the top of my head.
It's repeated quite a few times in a row. But there's a whole little almost skit about it, isn't it? About
Yeah.
the but it's such a huge amount of money that
Mm.
he's never going to be able to pay it off,
Yeah.
and that's it. He will the best he can hope for is to become a sort of a senior prisoner, really,
Yeah.
and maybe get some favor that way, and that's all. So he's almost kind of like, well, this is my lot now. Every day he wakes up, he's lost some more clothes. Someone's robbed him his good clothes to sell it, or he's lost his hair because someone else is selling it to a wig maker. And I think he thinks that he remembers that. Hopefully, they don't realize that there's physicians out there who buy body parts. It's lots of little gags like that, very
Yeah.
dry and self-deprecating kind of humor. And but yeah, it does seem a little bit. Where's this story going? But I was interested to know because it was a very weird, like a busy start. Then there's almost the sereneness of this is Genevieve and this is her background, and then it's kind of real change, and it sticks with Detlef mostly on. It does divert off to the other characters, but it goes back to him. It feels like for the most of the rest of the
Yeah.
book, and it's driven by him, even though he's not really there for the first X amount of pages of the story.
Yeah. He definitely feels like the protagonist to me, as much as
Mm.
it's, we're introduced at the start through Genevieve's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and she's incredibly important. She's, almost a co-protagonist or a supporting protagonist, if you like.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that will be an important relationship and dynamic through the whole story. And then there's also Oswald von Königswald, who is the hero who defeats Drachenfels, who commissions Detlef to write a play, who's present throughout the whole story because he is this kind of noble hero, an elector count, or almost an elector count of the Empire, the ideal kind of protagonist, if you like, for a Warhammer
Yes.
novel, you would think. He's there throughout, but he's definitely in the he sort of stepped back a little bit. We see some stuff from his we follow him in certain chapters and sort of
Yes.
see what he's up to, but it's way more Detlef's story.
Absolutely. If it was a film, he would be a supporting actor, and so would Drachenfels probably
Oh
be.
yeah. Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
story about mostly Detlef, with a sort of supporting lead would be Genevieve, but the other two are your supporting actors in that, big parts, but and important to the story. But it's definitely. Sorry, my watch is trying to join in on the conversation. But they're not don't need to be present all the time in the story. It would
Yeah.
be very different if they were present. And the kind of the tool of telling it through Detlef's experiences of the play is just such a unique way of doing it, and not something I expected, having started the book or even made my way through the first 2 chapters or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool hook almost.
It is, right? Having the story like the first Warhammer novel, and it's not about war. It's not about heroes in a unit or squads going off and doing missions. It is about a playwright who is trying to capture sort of his version of the truth of a legendary event. So we've seen some of that legendary event, and obviously things start to happen around the play that then move us towards, okay, there is going to be some horror and some action again. But it's very much, it spends a lot of time kind of going, actually, this is almost a comedy. It's Shakespeare in love set in the Warhammer world.
It really is.
And it does a terrific job, I think, of through the comedy, through the enjoyment of Detlef as a character, through the interest. And there is obviously that mystery around Genevieve. She's quite an enigmatic character and quite an interesting character as well. Through them, it does hook you, and you do sort of want to continue and find out, is this play, are they going to stage the play, and is the climax of the book going to be whether or not they get the play right? But then obviously we sort of start to see Drachenfels re-emerge as a presence, and there's these sort of haunting signs. There's a couple of ghost monks almost threaten Detlef and kind of try and warn him off. There is a bit when they gather up all of the survivors from the original quest, including a couple of characters who seemed like they might have died during that quest, but somehow survived. And then they are all brought together to inform the play and help write it, and then to go back to the abandoned Castle Drachenfels in what is a great idea, I think. Let's go and stage a play in our nemesis, in his actual seat of power. And we're going to bring the Emperor, and we're going to bring everybody in the court of the Emperor to see it. And then on that journey, there's a really fun device, I think, where they have 26 carriages in their caravan, but they continually are finding that when they count them, there's actually 27, but then they can't work out what the 27th caravan is. It's such a weird,
it's good spooky horror.
Yeah, really spooky.
He just cuts in and out. So it starts with this kind of D&D meets Hellraiser. You get a little bit of the first 20 minutes of Joan of Arc style setting with the Britannia background history kind of thing. And then it cuts to Shakespeare in love, and then comes back to the kind of let's go to the haunted house for and see what happens. It will be fine, honest. Where all along well, something's going to happen, isn't it? It's that was one thing that didn't surprise me. There was lots of little surprises, definitely with the story structure and the way it worked, and a couple of things that happened. But I don't think it's any surprise to any reader that, well, yeah, he's clearly, he's going to come back in one sense or another at the end, because he's just so set up for that. But it's just it's bizarre. If you put it down, if someone said this is the way I'm going to lay the story out, you'd think, oh, that's a little strange, really. But it worked so well. And I don't think it would have worked the other way around. I think you started with Detlef, and then the story of the original attack was kind of told as tell me what happened so that I can write this play. I don't think it'd have had the impact and worked. And I think maybe people would have stopped reading early on, because there wouldn't have been enough of a hook. But it changes the pace in such a sort of delightful little way that it sort of works really, really well. Yeah,
I totally agree. I mean, how did you find the presence of Drachenfels like looming over the entire story?
I think it worked quite. I really liked the Lowenstein character. It felt very kind of almost the Boris Karloff looking kind of strange, tall, slightly weird, scary looking actor. Very comical, but it worked. It didn't seem too much. It was just right for the style of story, with the tongue in cheek a lot of the time. But yeah, I think it was there. I think it wasn't just him. It was through the castle, and then the weird happenings and things all the way along. So we talked about the monks. That felt like very kind of 1970s weird horror films where they didn't have any effects, but it was just some shadowy figures on a misty hill in the late at night or early morning. It felt very kind of, so I'm pointing at the hill, which is
at the hill.
The hill. There is a hill over there, but none of you can see. But it did it well with that. I think the spooky happenings, both at where were they before they went to Drachenfels? They were at Oswald's
Yeah, they were at
palace or something,
yeah,
some kind
the
of
palace of the Elector Count of Oslo.
Elector Count Oslan, yeah. So there was things started to happen there as well, and it's very typical horror, isn't it? That they're kind of something happens to someone, but everyone else is like, "Well, probably all right. I'm sure you're just making it up. It's in your head," kind of feel. So it's very, very classic horror film in that sense. But the way it was done, you knew it was Drachenfels, and you felt that sort of impending sense of doom, and you knew it was going to build to a crescendo at some point.
Yeah.
And again, I think because of the way the play was working and the way the play was just, I mean, it's not just a play, is it? This is some kind of almost living experience. It goes on for hours. There's breaks for meals, and then it goes back on for hours. And there's talk about the emperor worrying about whether his son can make his way through it without getting too fidgety. As a parent, I'm like, yeah. So if I take my kids to the cinema and it's more than 90 minutes, I'm getting worried about how many toilet trips we're going to need to do in the middle of it. I still don't know how they got across the bridge in the Dungeons and Dragons movie, because I missed that bit, taking my son to the toilet. But I liked all those bits because they were kind of real, and so bizarre thing to say, but it's quite real and relatable to the real world. You wouldn't often in a fantasy story or a horror have a character kind of thinking about, my son might get bored watching this.
But
It's not,
and that's what I mean about
you'd
those
think of
little
writing.
Yeah, it's really great because you have all of these little character moments across all of the characters, and it just deepens every single one of them. I think that, like, when you get introduced to, okay, here's an actor and they have a particular foible, or they are challenging, they're difficult to work with, or they're really good, or so you have all of these different moments with most of the characters. I think there's one or two characters that maybe just a tiny bit underwritten. So there's like a dwarf called Menesh, who was one of the heroes who loses an arm during the original conflict to the encounter with Drachenfels. He's in it, but we don't really see very much of him. He's kind of there to pad out the numbers, and then he's also one of the sort of dramatic,
because he's quite important at the end
on.
to a certain extent. He has an important moment at the end.
Indeed, yeah.
He probably could have been in it a little bit more, just to remind
we don't really
the
get
reader.
a sense of his character, I think, is the thing. I know, and dwarves generally, and we'll talk a little bit more about how this relates to the Warhammer world as we may understand it. But I think in terms of characters, for the main players, I mean, your Detlef and Genevieve, Oswald and Drachenfels, we get quite really well-rounded, quite deep and rich stories for those characters. But then all of the surrounding characters, supporting characters, also get really nice, interesting moments. There's some really sweet moments, I thought, with Rudy, who was the sort of hero who had fallen into that trap. He'd kind of been contorted and really injured. He did survive and then recover, but then he's lived the rest of his life just as a bit of a drunk, trading on that success of being part of the defeat of Drachenfels. And we also then find out that one of the other heroes who was there, a dancing assassin called Esbet, she was actually his wife. And she lost her mind during this quest to face Drachenfels. And she's been in an asylum the entire 25 years. And there's just some really powerful little moments with Rudy and that sadness of what he lost and his relationship. And then he is actually killed as part of a ritual to bring Drachenfels back. But he gets to host a party at the castle the night they arrive, and Detlef is sort of like, oh, we were going to have a party anyway, but we'll let Rudy feel like it's his party. So he kind of gets one last hurrah as being the hero of the hour. Everyone wants to hear his stories, and he gets to get drunk in good company. And then he goes to his very unfortunate fate. But as a reader, I kind of felt like, okay, he actually got quite a sweet send off before the horrific stuff, and those moments were really good.
There's almost an element of, you could have had those characters returning heroes and they'd all be back for the fight, but instead they've gone down a route of mental health issues, alcoholism, probably mental health issues linking to that as well. So it's kind of real, probably a much more realistic
Yeah,
way of the
probably
people
like
would
PTSD sort of.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's quite real.
Mm,
And yeah, really had a nice kind of, it was almost kind of have a nice send off
mm.
and put him to bed. Not
Yeah.
really, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And and Elizabeth didn't really have a nice end as
No, she
such.
had a
That was
rough
a
one,
little
but
bit more dark,
I
murdering
think
people and then taking
her.
her own life was kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of is more about her not at least having the moment of clarity to know that she didn't want to go back to Castle
Yes.
Drachenfels.
Yes.
As brutal and sad and tragic as that as her story is, it was very much a sort of self actualization, I think, of
Yeah,
right, I'm actually
yeah, I read
not
it. I
going
read
to.
it that way.
Yeah, yeah. So there's like interesting ideas like that scattered throughout, and moments like that throughout that are quite effective, I think, both in terms of
Mhm.
we talked a bit about the comedy and the horror, both very powerful throughout, but these dramatic moments as well that work quite effectively, I think.
Definitely. And they almost, they're not entirely significant to the story, and it's not a particularly long story either, so
Mm,
there's a lot of these small things in there that maybe you wouldn't expect to be in there for a story of its length. There's quite, it's not complex, but the number of elements make it a little bit complex in some senses. There's a lot of characters.
yeah.
That's maybe too many at some points, because you kind of, oh, because you might be away from, like we talked about, Menesh, and he kind of disappears through most of the book. Remembering, oh, that's, yeah, he's that dwarf, isn't he? Because
Yeah.
you're away from him for so long, and there's almost, because it's a group of players, they're going to be like that. But you've got those, and then you've got people playing the heroes, and then the people playing the heroes, and it's kind of a which one's playing what hero, and because it's not visual,
Mm,
it can be, there's a long list of the dramatis person, there's a lot of people in that book, in that sense, that only appear shortly. And I think there was a point where I was trying, because I knew we were going to talk about it, and I'm not just reading it the way I normally would, and I would just let it flow. I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to make a note. What did that person do? And then there was a point halfway through, I thought, I'm not going to do that, because I don't think these characters are that important to the
yeah.
overall story arc. But before you get there, you're thinking, do I need to remember this person's interaction here or that? So that the key ones become most important, I suppose. But
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Drachenfels, he's kind of painted as so. Before reading it, because I actually read it, this was the second time I read it. I read it earlier this year. Was the first time I read it, and before that, I kind of was given the sense that it was a vampire story, and that Drachenfels was Kim Newman creating his like fantasy Dracula for the purpose.
mhm.
I say that as if Dracula is not fantasy, but the Warhammer fantasy Dracula,
Yes.
and there's an element of that. But Drachenfels is so much more than just a vampire. He's also a worshipper of chaos, a great sorcerer. He's summoning demons. He's got all kinds of different abilities and powers. He leads an army of orcs and the undead and goblins and all sorts of stuff
It feels like a
through his
demigod
history.
rather than
Very
a
much so, yeah.
than a vampire. He
Hugely
doesn't
powerful
feel like a
villain.
vampire.
No, not certainly not in any sort of version
Traditional,
of a vampire that
is
we
there a
might
traditional sense? But yeah,
recognize. Yeah,
yeah.
like a Warhammer vampire. But then as well, so Drachenfels is not quite a traditional vampire from Warhammer. I think Genevieve, who is also a vampire and but a good vampire, also represents a slightly different take on vampires from what we would see elsewhere in the Warhammer history, if you like.
Yes, I really liked it. I like the idea of the not necessarily all bad
Hmm.
vampires, and I wasn't aware of this. So it was one of the earlier notes I scribbled. I was like, okay, well, she's accepted to a certain extent. People are wary to a point, but
Hmm.
probably more intrigued by her, attracted to her, than they are worried about whether there's any danger there, so to speak. There's definitely two kinds of vampire. That it's probably lots more than two, but there's two clear types: the kind of the fully dead, which are generally real nasty pieces of work, and the part dead, it's lukewarm. I don't know. That she's, and she's still. I think it's about feeling, isn't it? There's still an idea of feeling and understanding, and while she's quite a strange character in the sense that she's been alive so long that they just talk about her not really holding grudges and things anymore for being bitten, but then also for her father's death. She's gone past. She doesn't hate Drachenfels for killing her father because it's just too long ago, but she does have compassion for people and clearly cares about people as well, and almost is concerned that she might feed too long on somebody, and all those kind of very human
Mm.
elements, and the human elements of her seem very, very strong still. Feels like she's a human with a condition that means that she can't see herself in the mirror, that she has to feed on another's blood, and and she doesn't like sunlight too much, but other than that, she's still human at heart, so to speak.
I think that makes perfect sense. And the vampires thing, I also really like this version of the Empire that not only accepts halflings and dwarves and elves and all sorts of others. Vampires can live in the Empire as well, as long as you're a law-abiding citizen, basically.
I like it. Bring them back.
Yeah, I
I love it.
agree.
It'd
I
be
think it's
really good.
really good. An interesting idea that opens the door to some other interesting stories. And as this is one of those, there's no reason I don't think to. I mean, obviously there's lots of reasons, and they did do this, but separating out, okay, actually the undead have to be a very separate thing, and even within the undead, they later separate that out into Tomb Kings and vampires. You get these increasingly levels, sort of distinction within all of these different types. In this version of the Warhammer world, it's a lot more sort of muddy and kind of like overlapping, and it's not
Yes.
as defined yet. So you can do stuff like, well, there's vampires wandering around. There's talk of a convent for werewolves at one point,
I love
and
it.
that kind of thing. It's great. It's fun.
I'm trying to think where you see that kind of stuff. It rings a bell. It seems familiar with me, with vampires and werewolves being treated that way, and they're not always bad. I think it reminds me of. I'm trying to remember the name of the series now. Jim Butcher's the author, I'm sure.
The Dresden Files, is it?
That's it, exactly. I haven't read them for years. I was so there's elements of that in that universe
Hmm.
that they're not all bad. In fact, some of them are good. The werewolves are good in the Dresden Files, or the one group of them is. And vampires can be the same. Some manage to live a normal-ish, well, at night, but a life that on the good side of things. And this feels a little bit like that kind of thing. Obviously, this came before Dresden Files, but
Yeah.
I like it though. It's got more of a. It's almost like a 90s Buffy feel to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's a friendly element to it, and
Yeah.
it's kind of nice.
Yeah, and Genevieve even says, like, well, much like humans, there are some vampires who are bad people, and there are some
Mhm.
vampires who are good people. And she obviously is one of the vampires who is good, and she joins the quest. And as you say, it's not out of revenge, even though that's what Oswald sort of tries to use as leverage to convince her to join. She actually joins the quest because she's impressed with
Mhm.
Oswald himself and this kind of crown prince who has this real presence. He seems like a proper noble who is a hero. And we're told throughout the course of that early prologue that actually his ability to keep that group together and to forge forward through these impossible odds is
Mhm.
actually impressive. He's every bit
Yes.
the hero and the crown prince that he seems to be. And then
Yes.
obviously there's the veil falls over that when Genevieve falls unconscious during that encounter with Drachenfels at the end of the prologue.
Yes.
And then we return to Oswald as now 25 years older, still just crown prince. His father is ailing but still alive, but Oswald has kind of taken on all of the responsibility of being an elector count. He is this important political figure. He's cuts a fine stride. He's fashionable. They talk a lot about how fashionable his clothes are, not too ostentatious, just the right level of dressed to impress. So Oswald really comes across as a hero, I think. And I think that
Yes.
Kim Newman paints a great picture of, like, almost I was like a little bit in love with this Oswald guy. He sounds awesome. He sounds really great.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
but then obviously, as we get to the end of the novel, we discover that the true villain of the piece, as much as Drachenfels is returning and does want to enslave the Empire, he's only been able to do that because of a deal he's done with Oswald, our crown prince, our would-be hero. So how did you feel about that twist, that reveal?
It did surprise me. So I thought, yeah, I have no doubt that Drachenfels would come back, but I didn't realize that the knife at the throat of Karl Franz was oh, okay. And then it kind of made sense, but I suppose it surprised me again when he didn't seem like he was being forced into it. And I always felt like he would get to that point. Well, I'm sorry, he's made me do it. He's got control of me somehow. But he's, it feels if he didn't go along with the story, he couldn't have come back. He made the bargain with Drachenfels, obviously, that he would set this up. I mean, this is a long plan. This is a long game, isn't it? He's got a lot of patience to do this. But I just wonder at any moment Oswald could have thought, if I just don't arrange this play, it doesn't come back, because all the components he needs to come back, all these people's different elements, different people's body parts, essentially, that he needs he could have defeated him. Probably, he could have made up whatever story he wanted about how he killed him, rather than being handed a sword. But you find out that he maybe really did want that, or at least over time he's gone to, his mind has changed. He was young and impressionable, and realized at the last moment that he had no power to kill Drachenfels the first time, and usually you call him a coward, but you wouldn't do that in that situation. I think a lot of people would make that choice. The strange bit is how he kind of waits his time and does the plan as set out. I don't know if there's maybe there's something underlying there, but it doesn't feel like there's anything forcing him to do it. But
See,
maybe
I
he
quite
was in
like
danger.
that. Yeah, no, I think that's a good
Maybe those
point.
monks, whoever they were, we don't really know who they were, but maybe he would have been, maybe something would have happened to him if he didn't do it. Who knows?
But I like the idea that no, it is because he's bought into the deal. So I think, so on the Oldhammer Fiction podcast, which has done a great reading of Drachenfels, in that Lewis talks about, he kind of sees Oswald as this sort of cocky, almost like a sixth form prefect or a head boy kind of vibe to young Oswald. And I can
remember the
completely
Bullingdon Club,
believe it. Yeah, that kind of like very self-assured. He comes from this position of privilege. He comes from a position where he's supposed to be the crown prince. He's supposed to have the world at his feet. He's supposed to be the guy who can defeat Drachenfels. And then when he gets into that room, he's lost most of his heroes, and he has no plan. There's no special weapon, there's no magic artifact, there's nothing. He's just going to try and fight Drachenfels, who's this 8-foot tall necromantic vampire chaos lord who's been around for thousands of years, just ruling this corner of the old world, and he's just got his sword. And there's a real I can believe there would be a moment of just, okay, actually, the world isn't quite made for me, and I'm, as much as in this moment I'm going to do the deal because it's the only way I survive. Following that deal, and this was something that we talked about on my Patreon live stream where we did our book discussion, there were some really good thoughts in there just around the idea that actually following that deal, maybe he's rationalized to himself that the world's not right, because he should have been able to defeat Drachenfels. He should have been able to be the hero because that's where he was supposed to be. So now he's angry at the world as a result of it. He's angry at Karl Franz because he gets to be this heroic emperor, whilst the cowardly failure of Oswald, which should never have been because he's supposed to be here for greatness, he sort of rationalizes, well, I'm going to take it all then, and I'm going to do the deal with Drachenfels because the world isn't what it should be, sort of thing.
Yeah, it works. It's that kind of personality trait is something we see in real life, I suppose. So
just unbelievable arrogance that's corrupted him completely,
and that inability to kind of accept your lot or your place in something, and to respond to jealousy by, well, if I can't have it, then we'll destroy it. But he's a really interesting character. But I expected him to repent at some point, and he just he didn't. I was expecting a breakdown. Or
Yeah.
he may force me to do it. I'm sorry. And even after Drachenfels was killed, he didn't.
No,
Even at
he's
that
fully
point,
just all in on this plan. And I quite liked exactly what you were saying before about it is surprising the reveal that, okay, actually, the true villain of this piece, the character who we've spent so much time with, who's betrayed his friends, his emperor, and us, this guy, it's a surprise that he's done this turn, but also it's kind of inevitable. There's enough clues throughout. I mean, we've seen Laszlo, who is the actor who's playing Drachenfels, who ultimately transforms into Drachenfels following the ritual. He's been meeting with an agent of Drachenfels who might have been Drachenfels. We don't know, but he's had some sort of sponsor for much of his dark crimes that he's done over his life. A person who's appeared to him in a mask, who it turns out presumably was Oswald, arranging all of this stuff, arranging victims for him, arranging to get him
yeah,
to where he needed him to be. And then there is also this thing with the monks as well. So we saw these monks that appear to Detlef who warn him off, say, don't go to Castle Drachenfels. And then Prince Leopold, the Emperor's son, also sees the monks during the hunting party on the way to Castle Drachenfels. And he says to everybody in the party, has anyone know what these monks are about? Anyone know what they mean or who they are? And Oswald, in what's probably the first big clue, just denies it. He's like, I have no idea at all. Don't
yeah,
know what they are. And we know that he knows what they are because he's had a conversation with Detlef about them. So this is that
yes,
little
yeah.
moment of, okay, actually, it's not quite right here.
I think I put that down at the time just to he just wants this play to go ahead, and he's almost that kind of things are going wrong. This isn't 100% safe here,
Yeah.
but we're gonna. I can't cancel it now, so we need to get head down and get on with it. And yeah, and I probably didn't kind of
But
really
and that's
question
what's
it
great
beyond
about
that.
it as a twist, right? Because yeah,
Yes,
there is a reason, like a legitimate reason he might have been a bit shady there, but the real
yes.
reason is actually, oh wow, it's something way darker.
I think another thing that lends him legitimacy is that Genevieve, and we haven't talked about her too much, Fred, because she's this weird kind of main character, but out of it for so much. But she's very wise for her 600 years. She's a good judge of character. It feels like she's a good judge of character. She's got, she just seems like the calm person, the smart head in the room, even if slightly detached. But she's fooled by him as well.
Mm.
She, and I think because she liked him, she lends him legitimacy that you think, well, he can't be bad because she'd have noticed. She would have gone, well, this isn't right, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that lends to it as well. How does she get that wrong, sort of thing?
Yeah, I
Blame
think you're
her.
right. Yeah, I feel like that's spot on. And I think it's a good point. We've not talked about Genevieve as much as we should have. And I think she represents probably one of the sort of key themes in the novel, which is that the difference between appearance and how people perceive one another and perceive things versus the reality underneath. And obviously we see that with Oswald, where he seems to be the hero, but actually he's the villain. We see it with Detlef, where he seems to be a sort of layabout who's a bit maybe lazy and a bit self-involved, but actually steps up at the end and does the right thing in a couple of places. And
Yes.
Genevieve, who appears to be young, who appears to be almost this, frail, or not frail, but not a sort of strong warrior. She appears to be
Yes.
like a 16-year-old girl, is actually 663 years old and is incredibly wise and has had all of these different jobs and careers and this enormous life.
Yeah.
There's a real sort of interesting point there around who is what they appear to be and who is not.
So I couldn't picture her as young. I know she was described as a 16-year-old girl, but because of the her character, she was so knowledgeable and you told how old she was. I that overrode
Mm,
anything, any descriptor of her being young. So I didn't see her as a 16-year-old. I saw her as maybe a mid-20s, late 20s, obviously attractive woman. There's no that he uses her quite a lot in that sense. There's sort of romantic interest and
yeah.
attraction with a few people that underlies that, and that's kind of playing on the whole idea of a sexy vampire, which we see in so many different worlds. No, it's a thing, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
not vampires. There's a few vampires that aren't like that. There's lots of different versions of vampires out there. There's the almost bestial style, but an awful lot of it is attractive people, isn't it? In
Yeah.
films and stories, and that the book leans into that quite a lot, doesn't it? She's
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some Anne Rice kind of inspiration drawn in the creation of this version of vampires for Warhammer, and because you even have at one point there is the grandmother character of Genevieve who appears to be almost like a 12-year-old girl or potentially even younger than that, even though she's even
yes,
older than
yeah,
Genevieve, and she kind of talks like a grandmother, but like talks about having sired all these vampires and enjoyed life, and now she's in her retirement and her dotage when actually she looks like a child. That's straight out of Interview with a Vampire, right? And there's a lot of
yes,
other
yeah,
stuff like that. And the
yeah.
eroticism of
And that
vampires
was
is definitely
because she
brought
was
out.
only in it for a short period. That was it. I could accept that because it was described in that moment in the book.
Mm.
But because the way Genevieve was written and the situation she finds herself in, I mean, they're not erotic scenes, but there's definitely
There's
sexually charged
romantic scenes,
moments
yeah,
in
for sure.
in the feeding and things. There's, that's deliberate.
Mm.
Again, probably to titillate 15-year-old boys reading the books back in the 90s, but it's definitely there. And
Yeah,
I'm quite my brain definitely was well away from this is a younger girl at those
sure.
points. It didn't feel like that. It felt quite mature.
Yeah,
And her
I think you're right.
and
That's how it's
her
written.
attitude to it, and that like the I don't want to feed too much. I don't want to endanger these people. That kind of care and stuff feels mature and older.
Yeah.
So it's easy as a reader. Well, I found it easy to just picture her as as someone much older, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's definitely written in that way. And I think that's probably a good thing in the sense that yes, she is written as a character who has 600 years worth of experience, knows what she's doing, and is like is comfortable in her own skin in a way that
Mhm.
some of the other characters maybe aren't. I mean, obviously Oswald is not comfortable at all, despite all of his privilege. And Detlev, I think, over the course of the novel, finally discovers who he is, and he sort of
Mhm.
finds himself as not quite as selfish and that early version of Detlef that we see, he's never totally selfish. He's not a terrible person by any means. He helps all of the other prisoners from his debtor's prison
Yes,
cell.
really nice touches like
Yeah,
that, and
there's
it's
things like that where so there's the seeds of okay, actually he's not a bad guy, and he's got a great friend, Brughel, who is a human who suffers from dwarfism or afflicted with dwarfism, uh, and who is constantly mistaken for a dwarf by other
yes,
humans.
that's quite an interesting kind of
Very interesting
narrative in the
character.
book as
Yeah, it
well.
creates a really interesting point of sort of seeing prejudice in this world because the
Yeah.
dwarves reject him and the humans reject him because he's of neither world. And then
Mhm.
it transpires that he also has been afflicted with a sort of chaos, the mutations of chaos as well.
And that's
So
probably
he,
why they use it as a device to talk about prejudice around. We talked
mm,
about this with the way mutation is treated in ignorant
yes,
armies, and it's really interesting that that kind of it's almost pseudo medical problem rather than
yeah,
that kind of get you to the warp you you beast of chaos kind of thing. And it's a there's a real change there, and I think that's why the prejudice around dwarfism is used in the story because it almost leads into how people react to him when they find out that he's a mutant. And it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it's not long after someone else has been murdered. Secret passages lead back to all the players' rooms, and then they discover him um, naked or naked enough that his mutation is showing in it. And when
mm,
he's discovered, he starts crying because he knows the game's up. Then he's unable to hide his mutations, and he gets blamed for the murders because actually he's a mutant and he's tortured and ends up well, sort of did he kill himself or not? He ends up exploding in a
yeah,
really strange death. But Detlef is upset, really upset about him.
yeah, and pushes for
And
him to be
continues
treated
to,
better as well, right?
yeah, and even in his even after his death, he
Mm,
wants some kind of retribution for him. He wants him to be remembered as a good person, not as a mutant, and that's almost a dangerous thing. It feels like it's a dangerous thing to stand up for
yeah,
in certain societies, in or maybe all societies in the empire at that point.
yeah,
And I thought that was really interesting, and almost quite mature in some ways. Real themes there that you could have not had in a fantasy book and people wouldn't have missed them, but it added some real kind of grimness and depth and reality to it, and add steps to the characters. And you like Detlef more and more, I think, throughout the book, and
Yeah.
things like that just show actually he's a really good person.
I agree. Yeah, and because I think you're right as well when you sort of say about that reveal sequence, that the scene where you find out, or the other characters find out that Bruchel is a mutant, and he does cry. And just before that, there's a little moment where he's had to himself, and he's sort of reflecting on the fact that he is a mutant and how he's not been able to live the life he would have wanted, not just
Yes.
because of the sort of physical impacts, but like his emotional impacts as a result of all that stuff. And that's quite a sad, poignant scene. And it's effective for a number of reasons, because it is quite emotional, but it's also a great it does double duty because it sets up a bit of a red herring, and we are now
Yes.
questioning, oh wow, is Brughel a villain here as well? So we're sort of put into the position of the bad guys who ultimately persecute him, because we're presented with enough information to know, okay, so he's sad and he's human and he has these feelings, but also he is a mutant and he has this sort of physical thing.
You definitely question, don't you? I
Yeah,
don't think I thought for any moment it was him, but could he be involved? Maybe.
exactly, and
That
it's
was
because
what
it's
it
and
was.
you're
It was,
supposed to, right? You're set up
yeah.
to do that, and there's a few things like that as well. I mean, even down to Laszlo even having a sort of a dark sponsor kind of creates this
Yes.
question of, well, there's a bit of a red herring around Laszlo then, because is he Drachenfels? Is he working for Drachenfels? Who is this other guy Drachenfels? Is Drachenfels not even going to be in it, and it's all some new plot, some new cult or something? There's a lot
Yeah.
of different ways it could go, and it draws your attention to Laszlo as the villain and draws you away from the hidden in plain sight villain. But then
Yes.
thinking more broadly about the kind of themes at play, besides that one of appearances and sort of whether people are what they seem to be, there's this kind of like meta, multi-leveled narrative, because we're we don't know the real events. We don't know what really happened in the original Drachenfels quest, but we're seeing someone trying to interpret it and put a play on, and the
Hmm.
play has the same name as the book. It's got the same 5-act structure as the book. So we're sort of reading it from this level, and Detlef is seeing it from another level, and Oswald and Genevieve are another level below because they lived it. And
Yeah.
Constant Drachenfels is over the whole thing. I mean, actually, again, in the Patreon chat, one of the patrons, Tommy, came up with a really good point just around that sort of meta narrative and how many different layers and lenses are at work. And it very
Hmm.
much seems to be from the mind of an author who likes stories and telling stories. And the reason he's chosen a play and the theatre to be the vehicle for a story in the Warhammer world is because you then get to sort of play around with what a story is and how you tell a
Yes.
story and interpret it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a, yeah, it goes back to what we were sort of saying at the beginning about how much of an interesting way it was to do that, an interesting way to tell the story, and it really pays off in the way it delivers it. Uh, and at that point of, oh, this is an interesting way, I still wasn't, you weren't sure how it was going to go, but that those multiple layers just fit together really, really nicely. I don't think there's much I would think, oh, I don't know if that worked, to be honest with you. There's very, I don't think there is anything really, a minor change here or there. But just paid off. Something you said actually in the Patreon chat when you talked about once Drachenfels has been defeated, and then you have Oswald fighting, and Detlef kills him, and you felt that it should have been Genevieve. And I was working today while watching that, and I was like, yes, you're absolutely right. It did feel a little bit.
Yeah.
How much it's almost felt like Detlef wrote the story because he would have wanted to make himself
Yeah, because
make
you have
himself the hero again, because he'd already done this massively heroic thing, even if it wasn't directly him that was doing it, even if
well,
he
his
was.
heroic thing in the battle. So in the final conflict, we've had Drachenfels revealed on stage. Genevieve and Detlef are both on stage. In the royal box, we've got the Emperor now put is threatened by Oswald, who's got the knife to his throat. So you have this super high tension, high stakes scene. The fight with Drachenfels between Detlef and Genevieve versus Drachenfels is really good. There's a few different things that happen. Genevieve tries to defeat him. She tries to suck his blood, but he's this kind of weird corpse
Gross,
thing.
really gross scene, isn't it?
Really gross. So she's like sort of batted off, and Detlef's been thrown to one side, and Detlef finds this hammer that's been left. It shouldn't be there because it was used to create the scenery, but it's been left in the wrong place. And he grabs it, even with a dislocated arm. And there's kind of this moment where he could run almost, and he sort of is willing to stay, and that's his moment of heroism. But then the power of Sigmar flows through the hammer, which he then uses to kill Drachenfels. It's your pure Deus Ex Machina, the intervention of Sigmar, the god. It comes out of nowhere almost. I quite liked it because it's on a stage, and it's classic, like a device that happens in plays is you just get this kind of the intervention of the gods to resolve an impossible situation.
It's almost like Newman went, right, for this next paragraph, I'm going to make it a Warhammer novel again, like it was for that first part. I'm going to make it really Warhammer now, and it does it. But it didn't jar me at all. I thought, well,
it works really well.
Makes sense rather than Detlef just doing it without that, because it almost would overplay his character in the same way that maybe him killing Oswald slightly overplayed his character.
Yes,
and maybe that was added because Detlef got to do that himself without the aid of any.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Any power of Sigmar. So that wasn't Detlef that defeated Drachenfels. Really, it was the intervention of a god, and Detlef did his own heroic act there's lots of people that could have dealt with Oswald there. Lots of people. Oswald wasn't going anywhere. You've got these elector counts everywhere and they're guards. You've got Genevieve's coming back around again, and she could have dealt with him, and he does it, putting his own life at risk needlessly. Really,
that's a really good point.
So maybe it was his moment, but because it felt like he's already had his moment so close to it, kind of misses a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so I like the idea that his moment, if you like, is him choosing to stay and fight. Even though it's not his forte. And then Sigmar steps in and does the big final blow. You're right, though. Him having a moment of, he knows how to fence because he's a trained fencer. And he's even name dropped earlier in the story Oswald's fencing coach. So we know he knows how Oswald fights, and he uses that to win. So there's a moment of like, okay, actually, he's cleverly defeated Oswald here. I mean, my sort of pitch in terms of if there was a minor change I would make in retrospect, not that I'm questioning Kim Newman, because I think it's a fantastic novel, it's amazing. But if I was going to tweak something, it would have been that Genevieve steps in and defeats Oswald, because that closes the loop on their story, because they were together at the start. She was really impressed by him. She had fallen in love with him to an extent. Over the course of the book, that love and affection sort of slowly transfers from Oswald to Detlef, and we sort of see that in real time. And then this final moment would be the end, severing completely the relationship with Oswald, and it's sort of proving to be the right choice that she never actually did start a relationship with Oswald, even over those 25 years. She says she doesn't really know why, and it's because he's actually evil, and maybe she did.
Maybe she did know. And it would have been a nice pair, because I think Detlef stayed for his love for Genevieve. Really, that was it. It's almost that moment, I think, that he realized that he wanted to protect her, and that's why he did it more. I don't think he picked up or stayed because he thought I can save the known world here. I think it was for her, because she'd already jumped in. I suppose she jumped into attack anyway, so she almost saved him.
She did, definitely.
So she saved him, he saves her, and then is she going to save him? I don't know, but I'm with you. That would have worked quite nicely as well.
But you're right in terms of, okay, actually, it is a great moment for Detlef to prove himself in another way and sort of have that moment it's not Sigmar. This is just Detlef. And then Oswald is defeated. We do get a great cameo as well from Johann, who was the hero
Yes.
in the Ignorant Armies. So he's now back in the Empire as an Elector Count, having gone and saved his brother Wolf. That was really nice. I quite like that, because when I first read
Yeah.
the book, he was just a guy, and I was like, okay, there's some Elector Count who's pretty cool. Now, with a bit more knowledge of who he is, it actually plays as quite a cool
I like it.
MCU style cameo, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's you get success, and it's kind of this. The denouement is kind of a happy ending for pretty much everyone else, right? We sort of get. I mean, I thought it was very funny in the sense that we want to know what happened to Detlef and Genevieve. That's kind of, you're desperate to know what was their end of the story. And Newman goes through everyone else first, like pretty much every character that we've encountered, right the way back to the debtor's prison at the very start. We just find out, oh, and then this guy did this, and then this person did this, and then this person retired here. Some people get happy endings. Most people get happy endings, really, except for the people who don't deserve them. They all get a bit of karmic justice as well.
It's just like a movie, isn't it? It's like again, it's like a sort of 90s movie. When you get cut in between the credits, you'll get little pictures pop up of certain characters doing their, the couple that didn't get together hugging at the end or something. Or it's so film-like, and it makes sense with what he does. But it wasn't needed at all, really. But I didn't mind. But it was quite long.
Yeah, well, I thought it was funny for that joke of like just forcing you to like anticipate what it's going to be. But they get a nice happy ending. They end up together, Genevieve and Detlef gets to sell the Drachenfels play, slightly rewritten to reflect the truth at the end. And then he is very successful. He and his company found a new theater, and they rename it to honor Brughel, his friend who died during the events.
It's some kind of co-ownership as well, isn't there?
Yeah, it's like a cooperative.
It's a very weird detail to have in a story. And by the way, it didn't just own it; it was a cooperative.
But I think that's nice. I mean, that
it's
again,
lovely,
is
but it's also it's just these strange little bits of detail that you
Yeah.
just wouldn't think you'd find in a Warhammer novel. That's just nice, but odd.
So here's my question: given that it has, it is a slightly different flavor of Warhammer novel to many that we see over the years, and it is a slightly different view of the Warhammer world. There's those inconsistencies like the vampire stuff, and there's a few others. Constant Drachenfels himself doesn't work in the universe that will come to be the sort of standard Warhammer universe, because Nagash kind of takes on a lot of that power and a lot of that history.
Yeah.
With that in mind, do you think this would make a good Warhammer movie? If you were commissioning a Warhammer fantasy movie, the first movie, as this is the first novel, do you think this is a good introduction to the Warhammer world?
I think it would make a good movie. I'm not sure it would make a good Warhammer movie. There's too much that's inconsistent with the known norms. We touched on very briefly dwarves, and I think you covered it more in the Patreon chat. The dwarves aren't quite as recognizable as Warhammer dwarves, and I think you summed it up when I think it was definitely a couple of the patrons were talking about it, but I think you summed up these are city dwarves. These are imperial dwarves, aren't they? They're empire dwelling dwarves rather than dwarves from the dwarven hold. So that may be why they're different. That's absent from Warhammer by the time. Well, it's absent from Warhammer in Ignorant Armies in the world that Felix and Gotrek and Felix live in, really. At least they don't come up in there. So that disappears quite quickly. The vampires are different, but I think you can get around that. I think you can they just don't make their way to the tabletop, so to speak.
Sure.
I don't think Drachenfels is a problem either if you didn't have Nagash. I think the only problem is because they went down a different arc. So no, I'm not sure you could, but it would still make a great film. But it just it'd make a better Dungeons and Dragons film than it would make
yeah, that's
you've got more
interesting
scope
point.
there, haven't you? You got more
because it feels very much, I mean, kind of like some of the stories in Ignorant Armies, actually. It feels very much of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, more than Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I think.
It's first dead roleplay, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah.
Which probably I haven't looked, but I bet you there's a playwright career class or something,
Yeah,
it
I couldn't
surprised
say for
me.
sure, but it feels like there would be, right? And they did a lot of the characters from these novels and several of the other GW books as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay stats. They started them up. You can actually play. You can have Drachenfels in your game if you want
They're in
to.
here, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, there
They're
you
in that
go.
one.
Yeah, absolutely. And Drachenfels will just TPK everyone, right? Because as you would expect, unless you do a deal with him and then play 25 years
Yes.
worth of campaign. But
Well,
yeah,
you got a sledgehammer knocking
yeah.
around.
But I really like this version of the Warhammer world. This role play version. I think it might be my sort of, broadly speaking, my kind of favorite flavor of Warhammer Fantasy, with
Mhm.
this kind of messy, muddy world. And there's a lot of there's inconsistencies and there's stuff floating around all over the place. But it's such a fun world to spend time in. And I agree. I think this
Yes.
would make a fantastic film. I personally, because I really like this version of the Warhammer world, would love this to be the Warhammer movie. But I completely
Yes.
understand that it is quite different to a lot of other Warhammer. But
I mean, this for me, in my head canon, this kind of Warhammer world does exist,
hmm,
but it almost feels like the timeline that doesn't really move in the text has moved in my
sure,
head, if that makes sense. And that's I feel like that they all exist just in slightly different planes of existence, maybe, and
sure,
they all work. And the Warhammer world that's on the tabletop on square bases it is different, slightly different to the role play one, because you need more layers, and they all feel like Warhammer to me. But
yeah,
again, it's the era I came into to understanding Warhammer. My introduction to Warhammer was third ed fantasy and first ed Warhammer fantasy roleplay. So that was the year I was introduced to it. So it does feel very normal. But yeah, I couldn't see it being made into a movie that was. But it's a good enough story that it's very movie like. But
yeah,
I
very
just don't.
cinematic.
I don't think it's Warhammer enough.
Right, that's
And
fair. That's
the
fair.
only hammer in it isn't it might it might be wielded by Sigmar's, but it's sounds like something you'd pick up a B&Q rather than
Yeah, I mean it's fair. That's fair. I think you'd have an incredibly difficult casting process for Genevieve as well. So yeah, I think it would be very tough to find a
I
person with
don't
that.
think they'd make a 16 for a start. I think they'd have
No,
to stay well clear of that. That would be
yeah, but yeah,
problematic.
yeah. My summary, if you like, is just that this is it. This is a Warhammer novel. Everything I wanted, and it's everything I wanted because I didn't even realize I wanted it. I didn't know that I wanted a horror comedy about the theater set in the Warhammer world. That just was not something I was looking for. But as soon as I had it and I was reading it, every page was just, this is fantastic. And yeah, it flows really well. It's very, very like breezy, a very smooth read. I think you can fly through it. And I
Yeah.
think Kim Newman has said that he wrote it in something like 3 weeks because he was just in the zone, and he didn't want to lose the thread of the plot, and that's why he just kept on going and just powered through. And that probably speaks to what some people might see as filler, being some of these weird scenes or these little emotional beats or the kind of those odd details might be because actually it's just a stream of consciousness almost.
Yes.
But I like that. I think that works really well. I'm very excited that there's a lot more Jack Yeovil, so
Hmm.
Kim Newman's pen name. We've got more of his work to come
Yes.
throughout the rest of these GW books.
Yeah, I'm looking for. I mean, he was the only one I read before with the Dark Future book, so I'm looking forward to getting back to that and seeing whether they. It's been so many years since I read it that seeing whether I remember the stories or not. But I remember loving them, and I hope I still love them when we get to it. Um, but we talked about what would make Warhammer films. I'm not sure any of them will. I got a feeling we'll get to number 17 and go, yeah, well, none of them could be used because none of them will represent Warhammer. My feeling is they're probably all going to represent the time
Sure.
that they were
Yeah.
written in,
Most
which is good
likely.
because it's
Yeah.
really fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. They are, everything we've read so far is of its time. The sort of the political atmosphere and the nature of storytelling and the things that the writers have chosen to focus on and sort of elevate in the plot all feels like, yeah, this is definitely coming from the concerns and the thoughts, the artistic movements of the late 80s. And that might be why they're great as well, because that's when Warhammer was. If that makes
Yes.
sense. In a way, I know there's lots of amazing stuff in later Warhammer stories and the books and the different editions. They all bring their own cool stuff. But for many, and in many ways, and maybe for me, this is an era that is just like, yeah, this is the real good Warhammer stuff.
They all seem laced with, well, let's say all. We've read 2 books. One was multiple stories, though, so we think about that, laced with a mischievousness that you hear about the studio was at that point, and the way and their look on the world, and how they allowed that to reflect to the games a bit. And I think you see that with these novels, even though some of these writers were brought in externally. That's they brought in the right people to kind of keep that going. But good fun.
So I think we should add a new feature, Stu, which is just a thumbs up or a thumbs down for this particular book. So is this a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
Oh, absolutely. Really, really loved it. And it'll be something I return to one day.
Yeah.
Won't be something I'll be reading to. I'll be looking for books to read to Jacob, and this, because of certain elements in it, I won't be. In fact, there's lots of elements that I won't be, whether that be the horror or the
I'd hold off
slightly promiscuous bits. I'll let him read it himself. But it's something I'd like to return to in the future, because it's good. It's good fun, and it's an easy read.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But we're not going to be returning to this anytime soon, because we've obviously got another 15 GW books to go. We're going strong. Next up is Zaragoz. And this, I think, is the first in the Orfeo trilogy. So Brian Craig's Orfeo trilogy. Very excited to see this. I don't really know anything about this other than a couple of little bits and bobs. The actual nature of this story is going to be as big a surprise to me as everything else we've read so far. So
well, I read the blurb on the back of the book, and I'm still none the wiser. So it's going to
be. But that's what we're going to be reading over the course of October, and we're going to be back with another book club here on the channel at the end of October. Before that, there'll be another Patreon live stream discussion where we get together and chat and sort of share our theories, share our ideas. That's going to be coming mid to late October. You can find out more on my website. I'll put a link in the description below. All of my patrons are invited to come and join me for that and to share your ideas. And everybody is invited to the next book club that will be taking place at the end of next month. Until then, Stu, where can people find you if they want to get more Stu?
More Stu, Miniature Realms. On all social media platforms, you'll be able to find me Miniature Realms, but primarily the YouTube channel Miniature Realms. And it's lots of painting and hobby, including a lot of Warhammer fantasy or old world stuff now, but historical bits and stuff as well. It might be, if you like some of the videos in here and you play with toy soldiers, there will be some videos that apply, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some great stuff on there. You recently did an amazing sort of resculpt, a rescue of the mighty fortress as well, right? Which was really, really cool.
A repaint, I suppose. I've not sculpted anything on there for
But you created like a little keep for the center of it as well, right?
Oh, a little extra bit. Yeah. And that's growing now. I've been building some stuff this evening for some future Mordheim type stuff. So Mordheim will be covered soon as well. So lots of Warhammer fantasy stuff for people who like that.
Fantastic. That's great. Right. Well, let's leave it there then. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this book club discussion of Drachenfels. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.